Few philosophical questions have endured and perplexed thinkers like free will. Are our actions genuinely our own, freely chosen, or are they determined by a chain of prior events beyond our control? Daily life, we often assume that we are agents of choice and responsible for our actions. Yet, this belief becomes less clear when subjected to rigorous philosophical, scientific, and psychological scrutiny. The question, is free will an illusion, has profound implications. If we are not truly free, then moral responsibility, justice, and even our sense of self are questioned. This article explores the debate by examining the leading philosophical positions, the arguments for and against free will, insights from science and psychology, and the practical consequences of denying or affirming it. 1. Defining free will. Before diving into the debate, it is essential to define what is meant by free will. At its most basic, free will is the ability to make choices not entirely determined by prior causes or divine intervention. A person exercising free will can be said to have agency, the power to act intentionally. Alternative possibilities. The ability to have chosen otherwise in a given situation. Moral responsibility. Accountability for one's actions is based on the assumption that the individual chooses freely. Different philosophical positions approach free will with varying degrees of acceptance or denial, and these can broadly be categorized into three camps: libertarianism, compatibilism, and determinism, or hard determinism. 2. Libertarianism. Free will is real and incompatible with determinism. Libertarianism, in the philosophical sense, not the political, holds that human beings possess free will and that this freedom is incompatible with determinism. In other words, if prior events cause every event, there is no room for free will, if determinism is true. However, libertarians reject determinism and argue for genuine freedom of choice. Key arguments for libertarian free will. Introspective evidence. Proponents argue that we experience ourselves as agents capable of making free choices. We deliberate, consider alternatives, and sometimes even change our minds. This lived experience, they argue, is robust evidence for free will. Moral responsibility. If people are not free, holding them accountable, praising, blaming, and punishing them seems unjust. Libertarians claim that moral responsibility requires free will. Quantum indeterminacy. Some libertarians point to quantum mechanics, which suggests that not all physical events are determined. While this does not prove free will, it undermines strict determinism and opens the door to unpredictability in the brain's processes. Criticisms of libertarianism. Despite its appeal, libertarianism faces significant criticism: causal gaps. If choices are not determined, are they then random? A truly uncaused choice seems arbitrary rather than free. Scientific challenges. Little empirical evidence supports non-determined, freely willed decisions at the neurological level. 3. Determinism. Free will is an illusion. On the other end of the spectrum lies hard determination, the belief that free will is an illusion. According to determinists, all events, including human thoughts and actions, inevitably result from preceding causes. This view is deeply rooted in the physical sciences, particularly classical physics, which paints a picture of a causally closed universe. Key arguments for determinism. Causal chain of events. Everything we do results from genetics, upbringing, environment, and previous experiences. Even our reasoning is shaped by these factors. Neuroscientific evidence. Experiments by Benjamin Libet and later neuroscientists have shown that the brain seems to decide to act before a person becomes consciously aware of making a choice. This implies that our sense of agency might be a post hoc rationalization. Predictive models. Behavioral science can often predict human actions with remarkable accuracy, supporting that our decisions are influenced by factors outside our conscious control if not dictated. Implications of determinism. If determinism is true, then as commonly understood, free will does not exist. This challenges the foundations of law, ethics, and interpersonal relationships. However, determinists argue that recognizing the illusion of free will can lead to a more compassionate and scientifically informed society. 4. Compatibilism. Free will and determinism can coexist. Compatibilists attempt to reconcile free will with determinism. They redefine free will not as the capacity to have acted differently in an identical past but as the ability to act by one's motivations, desires, and reasoning processes, even if those motivations are themselves determined. Key arguments for compatibilism. Redefining freedom. Compatibilists argue that freedom doesn't require absolute independence from causality but freedom from coercion or compulsion. A person is free if they act voluntarily. Moral responsibility. Even if our desires have causal roots, we can still be held responsible if our actions align with our character and values. Everyday intuition. In practice, we distinguish between actions done freely, for example, choosing what to eat, and those done under duress, example, being forced to steal. This distinction remains meaningful in a deterministic world. Challenges to compatibilism. Critics argue that compatibilism changes the definition of free will to make it compatible with determinism without addressing the core philosophical problem. Is responsibility still justified if all our desires and beliefs result from prior causes? 5. The role of consciousness and neuroscience. Recent findings in neuroscience complicate the free will debate. Studies by Benjamin Libet and others have shown that brain activity indicating a decision occurs before a person becomes aware of making that decision. This suggests that the feeling of making a conscious choice might be a mental aftereffect rather than a cause. However, these studies are controversial. Critics argue that the experimental tasks, for example, deciding when to move a finger, are too simplistic to represent complex decision-making. Moreover, later research has shown that conscious intention still plays a role in modifying or vetoing actions, indicating that consciousness may not be entirely epiphenomenal. Additionally, brain plasticity and neurofeedback suggest that humans can change their behavior and thought patterns over time, implying a degree of control and self-regulation. Whether this is free will or just another layer of determinism remains a hot debate. 6. The illusion of choice, a psychological perspective. From a psychological standpoint, our choices are influenced or even determined by unconscious biases, cognitive heuristics, and emotional responses. We often believe we are acting freely when, in fact, we are responding to environmental cues and internal drives. Marketing, for instance, leverages this knowledge to guide consumer behavior, exploiting our vulnerabilities without conscious awareness. Similarly, habits and social norms shape our behavior in ways that feel voluntary but may not be. This has led some psychologists to argue that free will is a necessary illusion, an evolved belief that supports social cohesion and self-regulation, even if it's not strictly true. 7. Practical implications. What if free will is an illusion? If free will is indeed an illusion, what follows? Legal and moral responsibility. Our justice systems are built on the assumption that individuals are responsible for their actions. If determinism is true, this foundation is shaken. Some philosophers advocate for a justice system that focuses more on rehabilitation than punishment, based on understanding behavioral causality rather than moral blame. Personal identity and meaning. The belief in free will supports a narrative of personal growth, struggle, and redemption. Removing it risks reducing people to complex biological machines. Yet, some argue that understanding our lack of freedom can increase empathy and reduce moralistic judgments. Motivation and agency. Surprisingly, some studies suggest that believing in free will is beneficial. People who think they have agency tend to perform better, take more responsibility, and engage in pro-social behavior. However, this raises ethical questions about whether belief should be maintained even if it is false. A middle path? Perhaps the most balanced view acknowledges the limits of human freedom while preserving meaningful notions of responsibility and agency. We may not be free in the libertarian sense, but neither are we entirely puppets. Human decision-making is a complex interaction between biology, environment, and reflection. Modern thinkers like Daniel Dennett argue for a pragmatic view. Even if the ultimate foundations of free will are illusory, we can still meaningfully talk about choice, deliberation, and responsibility within the framework of human psychology and society. So, is free will an illusion? The answer depends mainly on how we define free will. If we mean complete independence from causality, the evidence suggests this is unlikely. If we define it as the capacity to reflect, deliberate, and act according to our values, even within a determined system, then free will may not be dead. Ultimately, the free will debate may be less about metaphysical absolutes and more about what kind of human experience we want to cultivate. Whether or not we are metaphysically free, we are undeniably responsive, reflective creatures capable of growth and change. And in that lies a kind of freedom worth preserving.